The lecture hall was already full when Elliot Bryce walked in 12 minutes early. That was the first thing that surprised him. 78 alien cadets in tiered polymer seating, arranged by species cluster the way they always arrange themselves when nobody forced a different configuration. Thessari in the upper left quadrant, tall and angular, their storm gray skin catching the overhead light like brushed steel. Gorathi packed into the reinforced lower rows, their armored carapaces clicking softly against seat backs designed for species half their density. A cluster of Vresi near the middle, translucent skin flickering with nervous bioluminescence. 2 Kelthari in the back corner, whispering in a sub-frequency Bryce could feel in his molars but not hear. Every one of them was staring at him. Bryce set his satchel on the lectern, a battered leather thing that looked like it had survived atmospheric re-entry, which it had once on a transport that lost cabin pressure over Thurrock Station, and pulled out a single datapad. He did not pull out a weapon. He did not pull out a tactical overlay. He did not pull out any of the things these cadets had spent the last 3 semesters being taught to respect. He pulled out a chair, sat down in front of the lectern instead of behind it, and waited. The silence lasted 11 seconds. Bryce counted. A Thessari cadet in the 3rd row, Cadet Sarath Vaughn, according to the roster Bryce had memorized on the shuttle, broke it. You are the new ethics and strategic philosophy instructor. It was not a question. It was a classification. Thessari didn't ask questions when they already knew the answer. They made statements and waited for you to confirm or deny. I am, Bryce said. You are human. Also true. Humans do not teach at Vareth Call. Bryce looked at her. Sarath Vaughn was tall even for a Thessari, with the narrow cranial ridges of the Southern Highland phenotype, and eyes the color of heated amber. She sat with her spine absolutely straight, her hands flat on her thighs, her chin at precisely the angle Bryce had seen in every Thessari military portrait he'd studied. They do now, he said. A low grinding sound from the Gorathi section. Bryce had learned to read Gorathi vocalizations during his year on Korath Prime. This one meant something between skepticism and anticipation, a waiting to be proven wrong sound. The Gorathi who made it was a wide, heavy-shelled cadet named Torek Gan, and his file said he'd broken a sparring drone with his bare hands during orientation. Bryce liked him already. My name is Elliot Bryce. I hold no military rank. I have never commanded a unit, fired a ship-to-ship weapon, or completed a combat certification in any species program. He let that land. The bioluminescent flickering among the Vresi intensified surprise, maybe, or discomfort. I have a doctorate in comparative ethics from the University of Edinburgh on Earth, a secondary credential in xenolinguistic philosophy from the Tharvan Institute, and I spent 4 years as a civilian consultant to the Allied Species Conflict Mediation Board. The Commandant of Vareth Call invited me here because your graduating classes have the highest tactical scores in the sector and the highest post-deployment ethical violation rate in the Alliance. The silence was different this time, not curiosity, something colder. Sarath Vaughn's amber eyes narrowed. You are saying we are deficient. I am saying you are the best trained fighters in the sector who keep making decisions in the field that get your own allies killed, surrender terms violated, and civilian populations mishandled. Your tactics are exemplary, your judgment is not. The Commandant thinks that's a curriculum problem. I agree with him. Torek Gan's grinding shifted pitch, lower, the Gorathi equivalent of a drawn breath before speaking. The curriculum has produced 12 generations of fleet officers. It has, Bryce said, and the mediation board has opened investigations into officers from 9 of those 12 generations, not for incompetence, for choices. He held up the datapad. I have the case files. I also have the tactical after-action reports that commended those same officers for operational success. They won their engagements. They also did things during those engagements that their own alliance partners filed grievances about. Those two facts are not contradictory. They are the problem. A Vresi cadet near the center of the hall, small, luminous, with the rapid blinking membrane pattern Bryce had learned to read as intense focus, raised a thin, four-fingered hand. "What is the purpose of this course?" "To teach you to think," Bryce said. The hall went very still. "You already know how to fight. You know how to plan. You know how to execute under pressure. Every one of you can clear a room, hold a line, coordinate a drop, or run an extraction. None of that is my business." He leaned forward in his chair. "My business is the moment between the order and the action. The 2 seconds when you decide how to do what you've been told to do. That space, that gap, is where ethics lives. And right now, this academy does not teach you that it exists." Sereth Vaughn looked at the Thessari on either side of her, then back at Bryce. "We are taught the laws of engagement." "You are taught the rules," Bryce said. "You are not taught to think about why the rules exist, what to do when the rules conflict with each other, or how to make a decision when no rule covers the situation you're in. You are taught to follow. You are not taught to reason." The Gorathi section went quiet. That was unusual. Gorathi were rarely quiet. Their species processed through vocalization the way humans processed through internal monologue. Silence from a Gorathi meant the grinding had moved inside. Bryce stood and walked to the center of the floor below the tiered seating, where every cadet could see him without turning. He was aware of how he looked to them, small, soft-skinned, wearing a civilian jacket over a plain shirt, no insignia, no armor, no sidearm. He was the least physically imposing thing in the room by a factor of 5. He didn't care. He'd learned a long time ago that the most dangerous weapon in any room was the question nobody wanted to ask. "First exercise," he said. "Scenario 1. He tapped his datapad. A holographic projection bloomed above the lecture floor, a tactical map showing a standard colonial settlement. Structures marked in blue, hostile positions in red, civilian clusters in white. Standard pacification operation. Your unit has been deployed to secure a colonial settlement occupied by a hostile force. The hostiles are using civilian structures as shielding. Tactical doctrine says you can neutralize the hostile positions with orbital kinetic strikes, clean, efficient, minimal risk to your unit." He looked up at 78 faces. "What do you do?" Sereth Vaughn answered immediately. "Execute the strike." Hostile forces forfeited civilian protection by using civilian infrastructure for military purposes. The laws of engagement, Article 14, subsection 3. Bryce nodded. "Cadet Vaughn is correct. The laws permit the strike. The tactical doctrine recommends it. The after-action review will commend you for operational efficiency." He paused. "The settlement has a population of 4,000. Projected civilian casualties from the kinetic strike, between 600 and 800. The settlement's water treatment facility will be destroyed. The survivors will have no clean water for an estimated 40 days until relief arrives. Projected additional deaths from contamination and dehydration, 200 to 300. He looked at Sereth Vaughn. "Your answer is still Article 14, subsection 3. Her amber eyes held his. "The laws are clear." "The laws are clear," Bryce agreed. "And 1,100 people are dead. My question is not whether you can do it. My question is whether you should." The Vresi cadet with the rapid blinking membrane spoke without raising her hand this time. "The laws exist to remove that question. To provide a framework so that individual judgment does not compromise tactical objectives." "That is exactly what the laws are designed to do," Bryce said. "And that is exactly the problem. Because the laws were written to cover general categories of situations, and every real situation is specific. The laws tell you what is permitted. They do not tell you what is right. Those are not the same thing." Torek Gan leaned forward, his carapace scraping against the seat. "If we begin second-guessing the laws in the field, operational discipline collapses." "Maybe," Bryce said. Or maybe operational discipline that can't survive a question was never discipline at all. Maybe it was just obedience. The word landed hard. Bryce had chosen it deliberately. In Gorathi military culture, obedience was sacred, the foundational virtue of their entire command structure. To separate it from discipline was, in Gorathi terms, close to heresy. Torek's mandibles ground slowly. He did not look away. Bryce let the silence work, then he changed the scenario. Same settlement, same hostile positions. But now your intelligence officer reports that the hostile force is composed of conscript civilians from a neighboring colony who were pressed into service under threat. They are armed, they are shooting at you, they are also by any meaningful definition victims. He looked around the hall. Article 14, subsection 3 still applies. The law doesn't distinguish between conscript and volunteer. The strike is still legal. He paused. Do you still give the order? The hall split. Bryce could see it in the body language Thessari stiffening in their seats as they ran the logic chain, Gorathi grinding at different pitches as they processed, Vresi bioluminescence shifting toward the blue end of the spectrum that Bryce had learned to associate with moral discomfort. A Kelthari cadet in the back row. Bryce had almost forgotten they were there. Kelthari were unnervingly still when they were thinking. Spoke for the first time. Her voice was layered, harmonic, like three people speaking the same words at slightly different pitches. You are asking us to make a decision that the law has already made for us. No, Bryce said. I am asking you to notice that the law made a decision for you, and to ask whether that is acceptable. The Kelthari cadet's secondary eyelids flickered. Why would that matter? The law is the law. On Earth, Bryce said, we had a principle. It was tested most harshly in the aftermath of our worst wars, conflicts that produced atrocities carried out by soldiers who were following legal orders. The principle was simple. Lawfulness does not equal morality. A legal order can be an immoral act, and the individual who carries out that act bears moral responsibility regardless of what the law permitted. The hall was silent. Your alliance has no equivalent principle, Bryce continued. Your laws of engagement are treated as moral absolutes. If the law permits it, it is ethical. If the law prohibits it, it is unethical. There is no space between. And that is why your officers keep winning engagements and losing the peace afterward, because they are making decisions that are legally defensible and morally catastrophic, and they do not have the conceptual vocabulary to understand the difference. Sareth Vaughn's hands had come off her thighs. She was gripping the edge of her desk. If the law is not the final authority on what is right, then what is? You are, Bryce said. The word dropped into the hall like a stone into still water. Bryce watched the ripples move through the species clusters, Thessari exchanging glances, Gorathi vocalizations rising, Vresi flickering in cascading patterns of uncertainty. Every one of you, he said. Every officer who gives an order, every soldier who executes it. You are the final moral authority for your own actions. The law is a tool, a useful one, a necessary one, often a good one. But it is not your conscience. Your conscience is your conscience. And this course exists because the Alliance has realized that 12 generations of officers who were never taught to use theirs have cost it more than any enemy fleet. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and let them sit with it. The first class ran 40 minutes over the scheduled block. Nobody left. Bryce noticed that detail and filed it. The second week, the resistance began. Bryce had expected it. He'd read the institutional history of Varath Kal with the thoroughness of a man who understood that every institution was a living organism with its own immune system, and he was the foreign body. The question was never whether the immune response would come, but when and in what form. It came in the form of Commandant Dreln Vashari, who summoned Bryce to his office on the morning of Day 8. Vashari was a Thessari of the old school, broad-shouldered by Thessari standards. with deep-set amber eyes that had seen 30 years of fleet operations. His office was a monument to operational achievement. Campaign displays, commendation hollows, a tactical map of the Varath corridor that he'd held against the Krevari incursion with 6 ships when doctrine said he needed 18. 3 of my senior instructors have filed formal objections to your curriculum, Vashari said. He didn't offer Bryce a seat. Bryce took one anyway. They say you are undermining tactical confidence in the cadets. Am I? Instructor Threll says his advanced tactics students are second-guessing strike protocols. Instructor Korath says her close-quarters cadets are asking about proportionality during live drills. Instructor Bale says, and I quote, "The human is teaching them to hesitate." Bryce nodded. Instructor Bale is half right. I am teaching them to think. Thinking takes time. To someone who has never seen it before, it looks like hesitation. Vashari's jaw tightened. I brought you here because the mediation board's reports were becoming difficult to ignore. I did not bring you here to dismantle my training program. You didn't bring me here to maintain it either, Bryce said. You brought me here because your training program produces officers who follow orders without understanding them, and the Alliance is running out of patience with the results. If all you wanted was someone to teach a Laws of Engagement review course, you could have hired a Thessari legal scholar. You hired a human philosopher. That should tell you something about what you already know the problem is. Vashari stared at him for a long time. The Thessari didn't blink the way humans did. Their secondary membranes swept laterally in a motion that looked, to human eyes, like a slow wince. You have until mid-semester review, Vashari said. If the tactical instructor's assessments show degraded combat performance, I will terminate the appointment. Fair, Bryce said. He stood. One request. What? Stop telling Instructor Bale to sit in on my lectures. She's welcome to attend, but she's been filing objections based on second-hand reports from cadets she's debriefing after my class. If she wants to object to what I teach, she should hear it herself. Vashari's secondary membrane swept again. I'll consider it. Bryce left. He didn't look back. He had a class in 40 minutes, and he'd spent the previous night revising the scenario he'd planned for it. The scenario was this. A patrol ship intercepts a cargo vessel in contested space. The cargo vessel is carrying medical supplies to a colony that has been quarantined by the Alliance for harboring insurgents. The laws prohibit delivering supplies to quarantined zones. The medical supplies will save an estimated 1,200 lives, most of them children. The captain of the patrol ship has 3 options, Bryce said, standing at the center of the lecture floor with the holographic scenario rotating above him. Option 1. Enforce the quarantine. The cargo vessel is turned back. The supplies do not reach the colony. The 1,200 die. The captain has followed the law. He let that sit. Option 2. The captain allows the cargo vessel through. The supplies reach the colony. The 1,200 live. The captain has violated the quarantine order and will face court-martial. Her career is over. She may face imprisonment. He turned slowly, making eye contact with cadets across the hall. Option 3. The captain seizes the cargo, takes it to the colony herself under military authority, claims operational necessity, and argues the case afterward. The supplies arrive. The 1,200 live. The captain has technically violated the quarantine but done so within the framework of an arguable interpretation of operational necessity doctrine. She will probably survive the court-martial. She will definitely make enemies. Sarath Von spoke first. Option 1 is correct. Option 1 is legal, Bryce said. Is it correct? The quarantine exists for a reason. The insurgents in that colony are using civilian populations as leverage. If we break quarantine, we reward that strategy. That is an excellent tactical argument, Bryce said, and the 1,200 children are still dead. War has costs. It does. My question is who decides which costs are acceptable, and whether that decision should be made by a law written in a conference room 3 sectors away, or by the captain who is looking at the medical scan data and the projected casualty numbers on her own bridge. Torek Gan leaned forward. He'd been doing that more often in the second week, leaning forward, mandibles still, all 4 arms folded tight against his thorax in the posture Bryce had learned to read as intense internal processing. You keep returning to the individual, to the single officer, to the single decision. I do. In Gorathi doctrine, the individual is subordinate to the structure. The structure exists because individual judgment is unreliable. The chain of command exists because no single officer possesses sufficient perspective to override collective wisdom. And yet, Bryce said, every atrocity your alliance has investigated was committed by individual officers who followed the collective wisdom of their chain of command. The structure didn't prevent those outcomes. The structure enabled them, because the structure told those officers that they were not responsible for the consequences of legal orders, that responsibility belonged to the structure itself. And the structure, being abstract, could never actually bear it. Torek went silent. His mandibles ground once, then stopped. The Vresi cadet Bryce had learned her name was Eliath Sen, and she was the daughter of a Vresi diplomatic attaché who had spent 3 years on Earth as part of the cultural exchange program. Spoke from the center of the hall. My parent told me about a human concept. They called it, she paused, her bioluminescent skin cycling through a complex pattern that Bryce recognized as the Vresi equivalent of searching for a word in a language that didn't have one. Conscience. The word came out in Standard, not in Vresi. It had no Vresi equivalent. Yes, Bryce said. They said it was a form of internal governance, a mechanism by which individual humans regulated their own behavior, according to principles that superseded external authority. That is a very precise definition, Bryce said. Your parent understood it well. My parent also said that humans frequently ignored their conscience, betrayed it, rationalized around it, and suffered for it afterward. They said it was another pause, another cycling pattern, unreliable. Also true, Bryce said. Conscience is unreliable, it is inconsistent. It is influenced by emotion, by fatigue, by bias, by self-interest. It is, by every standard your alliance uses to evaluate decision-making systems, inferior to codified law. He paused. It is also the only thing that has ever stopped a legal atrocity, not a law, not a regulation, not a chain of command. A single person in a single moment who decided that what was permitted was not what was right, and who chose to bear the cost of that distinction. The hall was quiet, not the cold quiet of resistance, something warmer, something Bryce had been waiting for since the first day. He sat down. For next session, he said, I want each of you to find one decision from your own species' military history, not from a textbook, not from a commendation, but from an investigation, a tribunal, a grievance, or a sealed record. A decision that was legal and wrong. Bring it to class. Be prepared to explain why it was legal, and separately, why it was wrong. If you can't find the second explanation, that's the exercise. Torek Gan stayed after the hall emptied. He stood at Bryce's lectern, towering over the human by a full meter, his carapace throwing distorted reflections of the lecture hall's cyan lighting, and ground his mandibles in the specific low-frequency pattern Bryce had catalogued as respect despite disagreement. My species will find this exercise difficult, Torek said. We do not have a tradition of questioning completed decisions. I know, Bryce said. That's why I assigned it. Torek's compound eyes studied him. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? A human combat instructor. The other species send soldiers to teach here. Thessari send fleet veterans. We send siege commanders. The Vresi send intelligence officers. I expected a human soldier with soft skin and hard fists, and a point to prove about endurance. and instead you got a philosopher with a leather bag and no rank." Torek's mandibles shifted into what Bryce had learned to interpret as amusement. "Yes." "Does that bother you?" "It confuses me," Torek said. "You carry no weapon. You hold no authority. You cannot compel anyone in this room to do anything. And yet," he stopped grinding. His voice dropped to the frequency Gorathi used for statements they considered important enough to speak carefully. "And yet every cadet in this hall is doing the thing you are asking them to do, and none of them can explain why." Bryce looked up at him. "Can you?" Torek was silent for a long time. Then he turned and walked out, his heavy footsteps echoing through the empty hall. Bryce sat alone in the quiet, listening to the hum of the hall's environmental systems, and thought about the cadets who had stayed 40 minutes over time on the first day, and the Thessari who gripped her desk when he told her she was the final moral authority for her own actions, and the Gorathi who couldn't explain why he was listening to a man with no weapons and no rank. He thought about it, and he knew he was where he was supposed to be. By the 4th week, the assignments were changing the texture of the academy. Bryce heard about it secondhand, mostly. He wasn't invited to the tactical staff meetings, and the senior instructors kept a professional distance that sat somewhere between courtesy and quarantine. But the cadets talked, and in an institution of 11 species and 700 students, talk traveled in ways no species could fully track. Sarath Vaughn's research had taken her into the sealed records of the Thessari 7th Fleet's pacification of the Vren colonies, a campaign that was officially a tactical success, and unofficially a systematic violation of 17 alliance treaties. She'd found the specific after-action reports that documented the fleet commander's decision to use atmospheric denial weapons on a civilian agricultural zone to deny resources to insurgents. The crops burned. The civilians starved. The insurgents surrendered. The fleet commander received a commendation. She brought the report to class and read it aloud without commentary. When she finished, her hands were shaking. Torek Gan had gone further. He'd accessed the Gorathi military archive, which required his family's hereditary clearance code and a formal request that would, he told Bryce afterward, result in questions from his clan's elder council, and found the operational logs from the siege of Kelrath Station. A Gorathi siege commander had ordered the destruction of a docked civilian transport to prevent its engines from being used as improvised weapons. 1,400 passengers. The commander's legal authority was clear. The passenger's status was ambiguous. The commander had chosen certainty over ambiguity, and 1,400 people had died, because it was easier to destroy a possibility than to evaluate it. The commander was promoted, Torek said, reading from the log. His voice had the flat, grinding quality Bryce had learned to associate with Gorathi who were processing something that didn't fit inside their existing frameworks. 3 years later, he was appointed to the Joint Tactics Advisory Board. His decision at Kelrath Station was cited as an example of he stopped, ground his mandibles, continued. An example of decisive leadership under uncertainty. The hall was silent. Eliath Sen, the Vresi cadet, had brought something unexpected, not a military case, a diplomatic one. A Vresi negotiation team had brokered a ceasefire between 2 warring factions in the Outer Reach. The terms required one faction to surrender territory that contained their species' primary breeding grounds. The negotiation team knew this. The ceasefire terms were legal. The faction that signed them went functionally extinct within 4 generations. "My parent was on that team," Eliath said. Her bioluminescence had gone nearly dark, the Vresi equivalent of speaking through held-back tears. "They told me about it after I was accepted to Verath Call. They said they had followed the framework. They said the framework was correct, and they said they had never slept well since." Bryce let each presentation stand on its own. He did not comment. He did not editorialize. He let the cadets sit with what they'd found. Then he asked one question: what would you have done differently? The answers came slowly, hesitantly. In some cases, not at all, and the silence was its own answer, an admission that the cadet couldn't find a different path and was troubled by the absence. But other answers came that Bryce hadn't anticipated. Sarath Vaughn proposed a constraint she called proportional echo, the principle that any tactical decision's projected civilian cost should be weighted against the strategic gain not at the moment of the decision, but at a projected interval of 10 years. If the cost still looks acceptable at 10 years, she said, the decision may be justified. If it does not, the decision was expedient, not strategic. Torek Gan proposed something simpler and, to Bryce's mind, more radical. The commander at Kelrath Station should have been required to know the names of the passengers on that transport before giving the order. Not all 1,400. 10. Enough to make the decision personal. Enough to make it cost something to the person giving the order, not only to the people receiving it. The Kelthari cadet in the back row, whose name Bryce had finally learned, was Vale Tyrus, and who spoke so rarely that every sentence carried the weight of a verdict, said, "The problem is not the law. The problem is that the law allows the decision-maker to be absent from the consequence. The law creates distance. The distance is the failure." Bryce wrote that sentence on his datapad and underlined it twice. The mid-semester review came on day 42. Bryce sat in the commandant's office across from Vashari and the 3 senior instructors who had filed objections. Instructor Threll, a lean Thessari with the permanent scowl of someone who had been right about everything for 30 years. Instructor Korath, a compact Gorathi whose forearms were folded in the posture of closed judgment. And Instructor Bale, a Vresi whose bioluminescence was cycling in the flat, rapid pattern Bryce had learned meant controlled hostility. Vashari laid the assessment reports on the table. Tactical performance metrics for the cohort, unchanged from pre-course baselines. Bryce nodded. "I'd have been concerned if they dropped." "They haven't improved either," Threll said. "Your course is consuming 8 hours per week of training time that could be used for." "For what?" Bryce said. "More drills. Their drill scores are already in the 98th percentile. If tactical performance is your only metric, they plateaued before I arrived." Korath's mandibles clicked. "Performance is the only metric that matters in the field." "Then explain the mediation board investigations," Bryce said. He said it quietly. He'd learned from the cadets that quiet was more dangerous than loud. "Explain the grievances. Explain why your 98th percentile officers keep producing outcomes that your own alliance considers unacceptable. If performance is the only metric, your program should be producing flawless officers. It's not. Something else is missing. I am teaching the something else." Bale's bioluminescence spiked. "You are teaching them to doubt." "Yes," Bryce said. "I am. Doubt is the prerequisite for judgment. An officer who cannot doubt cannot evaluate. They can only execute. Execution wins wars." "It does. And then someone has to decide what happens after the war is won. Who governs? How resources are distributed? Whether the conquered population is treated as an enemy or integrated as a partner. Those decisions require judgment, not execution. And your graduates are consistently failing at them because they were taught that the answer to every question is in a manual. And when the manual is wrong, they don't have the tools to notice." Vashari watched the exchange without intervening. Bryce had learned to read Thessari well enough by now to know that Vashari's stillness was not neutrality. It was assessment. "I have a counter-proposal," Bryce said. "Let me show you what the cadets have produced." He placed his datapad on the table and projected the work from the 4th-week assignment. Not his words, theirs. Sarath Vaughn's proportional echo framework. Torek Gan's 10 names principle. Vale Tyrus's observation about distance and consequence. And 30 more proposals, frameworks, principles, and questions that 78 cadets from 11 species had generated on their own. Without a manual, without a doctrine, without being told what to think. "These are not my ideas," Bryce said. These are theirs. I gave them a question. They built these. Every one of them is original. Every one of them addresses a real gap in your operational doctrine. And every one of them was generated by cadets who, 3 weeks ago, had never been asked to think about anything that wasn't already in a regulation. Vashari leaned forward. His amber eyes moved across the projected text. Bryce watched him read Sarath Vaughn's framework and saw something shift behind the commandant's expression, not agreement, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of an officer who had spent 30 years in the field and had seen, firsthand, what happened when legal orders met complex reality without anyone in the chain equipped to bridge the gap. Instructor Bryce will continue through the semester, Vashari said. He did not look at the other 3 instructors. We will reassess at graduation. Threll's scowl deepened. Koreth's arms tightened. Bale's bioluminescence went flat. Bryce nodded once, stood, and left. The change accelerated after mid-semester. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revolution. It was quieter than that, the kind of change that happens when people start asking questions they've never been given permission to ask before, and discover that the questions themselves reshape the way they see everything else. Bryce noticed it in small things. In the tactical drills, cadets were requesting additional data before committing to strike decisions, not because they were hesitating, but because they wanted to know what was in the target zone. Instructor Threll reported grudgingly that the requests were slowing decision timelines by 4 to 7 seconds but improving target discrimination accuracy by 18%. The cadets weren't doubting their ability. They were expanding their frame. He noticed it in the mess hall. Species clusters were loosening. Thessari cadets were sitting with Gorathi. Vresi were sharing tables with Kelthari. The segregation wasn't gone, but it was thinning, and Bryce understood why. His course had forced cadets from different species to present moral arguments to each other, to listen, to find common ground across biological and cultural divides that the tactical curriculum had never asked them to cross. They'd started thinking together, and the social proximity followed. He noticed it in Torek Gon, who began staying after class not to challenge Bryce, but to work through problems out loud, grinding his mandibles as he tested ideas against his own species' frameworks and found the places where the frameworks bent. Torek had begun developing a formal proposal for the Gorathi Military Archive to reclassify the Kelrath Station incident not as decisive leadership, but as a failure of evaluative judgment. He had no authority to implement it. He wrote it anyway. He noticed it in Sarath Vaughn, whose proportional echo framework had grown into a formal paper she was submitting to the Alliance Strategic Ethics Board, a body that, until Sarath had asked, Bryce hadn't been sure the Alliance even had. It did. It had been established 60 years ago and had received exactly 4 submissions in its history, all from human consultants. Sarath's would be the first from an alien officer. He noticed it in Eliath Sen, who had begun conducting informal translation sessions with cadets from species whose languages had no word for conscience. She was building a lexicon, not definitions, but approximations, emotional coordinates, descriptions of what it felt like when you knew something was wrong even though no rule told you it was. The Gorathi word she settled on meant the grinding that does not stop. The Thessari word was closer to the eye that watches from inside. The Kelthari had no word at all, but Veiled Tyrus offered a phrase, the weight of the path not taken. Bryce kept teaching. He did not celebrate. He did not take credit. He did not make speeches about what was happening. He gave them scenarios, asked them questions, and let them build. The incident that changed everything happened on day 61, during a joint tactical exercise. It was a live-fire simulation, the capstone drill for the semester, run by Instructor Threll with full holographic combat environments and real consequences for failure. 8 4-cadet teams deployed in a simulated urban theater with instructions to neutralize a hostile command post while minimizing collateral damage. Standard parameters. Standard rules of engagement. Team 3, Sarath Vaughn, Torek Gon, Eliath Sen, and Vale Tyrus reached the objective first. The hostile command post was in the basement of a structure adjacent to a medical facility. Tactical analysis showed a clear strike vector that would destroy the command post with minimal structural damage to surrounding buildings. Sarath ran the calculation, then she paused. "There are heat signatures in the medical facility," she said. "The simulation's civilian population was supposed to be evacuated from this sector." "They were," Torek said, checking his display. "Evacuation was completed at T-12. Those signatures shouldn't be there." Eliath's bioluminescence shifted to the analytical blue-white pattern Bryce had seen her use when processing conflicting data. The simulation may have introduced them as a variable. Instructor Threll does that. Sarath looked at Torek, then at Vale, then at Eliath. "If those are civilians," she said, "the strike vector puts them inside the blast concussion radius. The structure shielding is rated for the direct impact, but the medical facility's secondary walls are lighter. They'll buckle." "The rules of engagement permit the strike," Vale said. Her harmonic voice was very quiet. "The hostile command post is a lawful target. Civilians in adjacent structures are an acceptable collateral risk under Article 14. Sarath's amber eyes were steady, and if this were not a simulation? The question hung in the air. Torek's mandibles ground once. Then he did something Bryce would later learn about from the exercise recordings, something that no Gorathi cadet at Varath Kal had ever done in the history of the capstone drill. He overrode the tactical recommendation, rerouted the team through a secondary approach vector that added 90 seconds to their timeline, and coordinated with Eliath to run a biometric scan of the medical facility to confirm whether the heat signatures were civilian or simulation artifacts. They were simulation artifacts. Instructor Threll had placed them as decoys to test response speed. The correct, tactical answer was to ignore them and execute the strike. Team 3 took 90 additional seconds. They confirmed the signatures were decoys. They executed the strike cleanly. They finished the exercise with the third best time instead of the first. Instructor Threll marked it as a tactical deficiency. Bryce read the assessment report that evening. He read Threll's notation. Team 3 wasted 90 seconds on unnecessary biometric verification of simulated heat signatures. Demonstrates hesitation in strike decision protocol. Recommend remedial drills. Then Bryce read Sarath Vaughn's after-action report, which she had attached to the exercise file without being asked. It was 3 paragraphs long. The final paragraph read, "The signatures were decoys. We could not have known that before verification. In a real deployment, the 90 seconds we spent confirming their status could have prevented civilian casualties in a medical facility. The exercise penalizes us for treating simulated lives as if they mattered. I respectfully submit that this is precisely the kind of decision-making gap that ethics and strategic philosophy exists to address. If the capstone drill cannot accommodate the exercise of judgment, the drill is measuring the wrong thing." Bryce forwarded the report to Commandant Vashari without commentary. Graduation was on day 90. Bryce stood at the back of the ceremonial hall in civilian clothes, with no rank insignia and no official role in the proceedings. The commandant presided. The senior instructors presented commendations. The cadets marched in formation, 71 of the original 78, the highest retention rate in 16 years. The ceremony was standard Thessari military protocol, formal, precise, hierarchical. Bryce had attended 4 alien graduations over his career and found them all somewhat interchangeable. The formats varied by species, but the underlying structure was universal. Authority conferring status on the worthy. He was thinking about leaving early when Vashari deviated from the script. "Before commissions are read," the commandant said, "there is one additional matter." He looked across the hall. His amber eyes found Bryce. "Stand, please, Instructor Bryce." Bryce stood. Every cadet in the hall turned to look at him. "The Academy has conducted its end-of-term assessment," Vashari said. "Tactical performance metrics for this cohort are consistent with historical baselines. Close-quarters scores are 3% above average. Cross-species coordination is 11% above average, the highest in 7 years. He paused. Post-exercise ethical decision-making scores, a new metric, proposed by Cadet Vaughn and Cadet Gahn, and adopted by this office 4 weeks ago, are not comparable to prior cohorts, because no prior cohort was assessed on this dimension. The hall was very still. The Strategic Ethics Board has received its first submission from a Varath Call graduate. The Gorathi Military Archive has accepted its first civilian-sourced reclassification request from an active cadet. And the Alliance Mediation Board has been informed that this Academy's curriculum now includes a mandatory ethics component taught by a civilian with no military rank and no combat certification. He looked at Bryce. There were objections. "I noticed," Bryce said. Something close to amusement crossed Vashari's face. It was gone before anyone else could register it. "The objections have been noted and overruled. Ethics and strategic philosophy is now a permanent fixture of the Varath Call curriculum. Instructor Bryce's appointment has been extended to a 3-year contract." Bryce nodded. He didn't smile, he didn't need to. But he looked out across the hall at Sereth Vaughn, who was standing in the front row with her hands at her sides and her amber eyes bright. At Torek Gahn, whose mandibles were grinding in the low frequency pattern Bryce had catalogued as pride. At Eliath Sen, whose bioluminescence was cycling in the warm gold spectrum Bryce had never seen from a Vresi before and couldn't immediately classify. At Vale Tyrus, who stood in the back row with the absolute stillness of the Kelthari, and whose layered voice had said, weeks ago, the sentence Bryce had underlined twice on his datapad. "The law creates distance. The distance is the failure." He'd carried that sentence with him through the semester. It was better than anything he'd ever written himself. That was the point, he thought. It had always been the point. Not to teach them what to think, but to teach them that thinking was their responsibility, that the space between the order and the action was theirs to own, that a weapon was only as moral as the mind behind it, and a law was only as just as the conscience of the person enforcing it. He hadn't given them answers. He'd given them the capacity to find their own. Vashari finished the ceremony. The cadets filed out. Sereth Vaughn stopped at the door and turned back. She looked at Bryce across the emptying hall. "Thank you," she said. It was the first time Bryce had heard a Thessari use that phrase without the formal honorific suffix. Stripped of protocol, the word was raw, direct, personal. Bryce nodded. She left. He stayed in the hall for a while after that, alone with the hum of the environmental systems and the faint cyan glow of the inactive holographic displays. The chair he'd sat in on the first day was still at the center of the floor, below the tiered seating, where he'd placed it instead of standing behind the lectern. He'd kept it there all semester. He picked up his satchel, the battered leather one that had survived atmospheric re-entry, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out into the corridor. The Varath Call campus stretched ahead of him, bright and clean, polished surfaces and cool light, and the distant murmur of cadets who were no longer the same cadets who had stared at him on the first day. They'd learned to think, not because he'd told them what to think, because he'd shown them that the thinking was theirs. The corridor was long and quiet, and Bryce walked through it without hurrying, toward the next semester and the next cohort, and the next room full of cadets who had never been asked the question that mattered most. Not what is permitted, but what is right.